Welcome everybody. I think a lot of faces are suddenly appearing, which is fantastic. Welcome to the first panel of the PSA Parliament Specialist Group Annual Conference. Very sadly, we're not in Birmingham as planned. As you'll see, we're all around the country and indeed around the world. So we're delighted, in fact, that by being virtual, we can have so many more of you joining us and so many fascinating papers. This is the first in a number of panels. The full details are on our website. And today we're going to be hearing from Professor Meg Russell, the Principles and Practice of Parliamentary Functioning Post-COVID-19, Challenges and Opportunities. Professor Lord Norton of Louth, Parliament's an Informal Space, the Unseen Impact of Crisis. Dalila Molade, Interparliamentary Cooperation in Times of Pandemics. And we may have a fourth paper. We're just waiting to double check on that. Okay, Meg, do you want to take us away?
So thank you very much, Alex, and thank you for inviting me to talk to the conference. I greatly look forward to this panel, what everybody else has got to say, and to the discussions afterwards. But for now, I want to focus on the very general and central question of what the COVID-19 period may have taught us about the functioning of parliaments and what lessons it might hold for the future. To keep things simpler, I'm going to focus largely on the Commons, and I'm sure that Philip will say more things about the Lords. I'll divide my talk into 5 parts, starting with the principles of parliamentary functioning, moving on to the practice under COVID-19, and then reflecting in turn on the potential opportunities and challenges presented by the pandemic situation before ending on lessons for the future. Some of my conclusions will be obvious and relatively uncontested among an audience of legislative specialists, but some I think present real conundrums. Some are fairly specific to the British case, but others present questions that parliaments all around the world will need to grapple with. So starting with the principles, we need to ask ourselves, what are parliaments and what are they for? These can be surprisingly tricky questions, but they're familiar to legislative studies scholars, and many have presented different overlapping lists of parliamentary functions and features. So to take, for example, Amy Kreppel's list in the Oxford Handbook of Legislative Studies, she suggests 4 main parliamentary functions: representation, linkage, control, and policymaking. Representation takes many forms, often including, as in our system, a strong emphasis on the geographic. A core principle is that numerous diverse individuals participate in the legislature, underpinned by a crucial democratic principle of equality, where each ultimately has an equal vote. Linkage is closely connected to this, as parliamentarians provide a voice in Parliament to their voters and remain accountable to them. This also connects to Kreppel's 3rd function of control, including holding the executive to account and scrutinising its policies. Her final function of policy making, for example through agreeing bills, is in turn closely related to that. Indeed, many scholars lump policy making and control together, which is what I'll do here. Some classifications also explicitly mention deliberation, including public deliberation. This underpins representation, linkage, and policymaking. Another common notion is legitimation. Through all the functions I've just mentioned, parliamentarians help ensure broad public support for policy. While some other public bodies perform some of these functions, the coming together of all of them is what makes parliaments unique. Moving on to practice, let's briefly consider some of the things that have happened under COVID-19 and their effects on these parliamentary functions. The pandemic's threats to representation were pretty immediate and obvious. With limits on travel, requirements for social distancing, and heightened risks for people in certain health categories, numerous parliamentarians gathering from all over the country immediately became a problem. Some national legislatures responded by limiting how many members could participate, with those members often decided by party leaders and whips. Westminster thankfully avoided that, instead rapidly moving to virtual participation. That enabled, at least initially, all MPs to continue participating equally, albeit in a very new and different way. Later, of course, agreement over this broke down, and government sought to end virtual Commons participation against the wishes of many affected members and of the Chamber's Procedure Committee. How that decision got taken, with many members still absent, clearly breached core principles of equality. Some participation rights were restored, but remote voting was replaced by proxy voting, with the great majority of proxy votes going to party whips. Even now, members who can't attend physically remain shut out of key substantive proceedings. Linkage plays very little part in this story. MPs have clearly had less face-to-face contact with their constituents, though other communications can continue. Short-term, this function has almost certainly been weakened. The effects on policymaking are bigger and more obvious. All over the world, there's been controversy about executives being granted emergency powers to tackle the virus, with consequent limits on parliamentary oversight. As time's worn on, those arrangements have appeared increasingly difficult to defend. But there have also been rather less visible effects. Non-government business in the Commons, such as opposition days, backbench business, and private members' bills, was initially suspended. Though later reinstated, it now seems somewhat under threat again. But if business is to be limited to urgent business, who decides what's urgent? This links to fundamental questions about who decides the parliamentary agenda, which I'll return to. There are then some interesting questions about the interactions between different changes. Most obviously, changes to the mode of participation to maintain representation have knock-on effects for the policy-making process. Currently, amidst a pandemic, the priority has been keeping the show on the road. But if looking for longer-term lessons from the current experiments, we need to consider these interactions, and this is where some of the unexpected challenges emerge. So based on recent experience, what are the opportunities and the challenges or threats created by these changes and the possible lessons for the future? If we view the two main impacts of the virus as having been moves to expedited centralized decision-making on the one hand and virtual working on the other, it's hard to see that the first of these brings many benefits, but the second does seemingly have potential to do so. Like for the rest of us, parliamentarians' remote working has allowed continued participation for those with caring responsibilities or health conditions. It's also facilitated easier access for those distant from Westminster. Many see virtues here in terms of representation, including possibly future means to make legislatures more diverse. Thus, the Centenary Action Group, which promotes enhanced women's representation, has a campaign to, I quote, promote the benefits of virtual parliament measures for women and minority groups and encourage the continued use of technological advances. Of course, Westminster's ability to learn from such methods was compromised by their early ending in the Commons. With respect to linkage, as I indicated before, effects during the pandemic have been largely negative. But in more normal times, virtual participation, particularly for those with distant constituencies, could be seen as an opportunity for greater local presence and local work. Given the chance, many MPs would surely take this up. But it would raise questions, long familiar to parliamentary scholars, about whether an increasing focus on constituency work compromises the effectiveness of MPs' policy and scrutiny work in Parliament. Turning finally to policy making, opportunities from virtual working would come indirectly through the greater diversity of representation that it facilitates, not just among MPs, but for example, in terms of committee witnesses. As we've all seen at many online events, perhaps including this one, those usually absent due to geographical distance can contribute through virtual participation. So summing up on potential opportunities, insofar as these exist, I suggest they very much flow from virtual participation and apply primarily to representation, with possible knock-on effects for linkage and policymaking as well. After that apparently happy story, the list of challenges or threats is rather longer. Negative effects on representation in the UK largely came from the strange insistence by Leader of the House of Commons Jacob Rees-Mogg on the early ending of virtual participation in Commons substantive proceedings. That might just be considered a UK quirk, but it sharply moves us to problems with the policy-making process in terms of government agenda control. While in many legislatures, the agenda is drawn up by some kind of cross-party body or agreed by the chamber itself, Commons standing orders, most obviously Standing Order number 14, privilege the government above all others in agenda setting. A relatively consensual and cross-party approach to decision-making adopted in the Commons during the early stages of the pandemic quickly broke down. both over procedure in terms of whether to retain virtual arrangements and increasingly over substantive policy. This was, of course, connected to the government's emergency powers and the use of delegated legislation to introduce new rules to tackle the pandemic. Ministers made announcements through press conferences and media briefings, seemingly with little thought to parliamentary accountability. MPs could ask questions, but were powerless to actually make decisions. Numerous statutory instruments were published at short notice and with almost immediate effect. Without the government scheduling timely votes on them, there was absolutely nothing MPs could do. Ministers were forced into greater consultation only after 6 months, when backbenchers threatened a mass rebellion on renewing the Coronavirus Act. This highlights problems both regarding delegated legislation and agenda control. But returning to the conundrums, the problems for policymaking went further than this. Some problems also flowed from MPs' absence from Westminster and from virtual participation itself. While key formal mechanisms of control and decision-making, like questions and bill scrutiny, continued, the crisis has sharply illustrated what many legislative studies scholars already know, that formal and visible decision-making is always crucially underpinned by informal and less visible communication. The absence of members, including in a relatively empty chamber, means there's been much less opportunity to sense the mood in the room. But more importantly, as my work on the legislative process has emphasised, formal decisions in the chamber and committees are built upon innumerable private conversations in offices, corridors, cafes and bars. Ministers and whips talk to members, members talk to each other, within and across parties, MPs talk to peers, and all these groups talk to journalists. This helps facilitate another key aspect of legislatures emphasised in my work, the crucial power of anticipated reactions. The reason that ministers don't generally get humiliated and defeated isn't because MPs are acquiescent sheep, but because these kinds of off-the-record conversations help people understand each other and prevent policies rejected by the government's parliamentary party from ever being put. There are multiple reasons why Johnson's government is currently in trouble. Arguably, recall the prorogation, he never had much fondness for parliamentary accountability. Many decisions being made are very difficult in an unpredictable environment. But Parliament's inability to function in the usual way through essential informal channels surely isn't helping. Relations have become acrimonious, surely in part due to the absence of normal communication. Parliament just can't function properly when many people are not there. So to end on the future, experience from coronavirus has reinforced the importance of some patterns familiar to legislative studies scholars, but introduced new conundrums as well. In terms of lessons, let me suggest 6. First, there are potential benefits for diversity of representation and participation in legislatures through virtual modes of working. This could facilitate greater linkage as well. Second, procedural change, unless handled carefully, can inadvertently strengthen party whips. Third, in terms of policymaking, the extent of government control of the Commons agenda is problematic. Fourth, the same applies to processes of delegated legislation, particularly where MPs lack agenda control. Fifth, while formal parliamentary proceedings are clearly vital, some of the most important politics comes through informal discussions, without which things can easily malfunction. Last, if Parliament's ability to deliberate formally and informally is compromised, and it's cut out of decision-making, this damages its legitimation role. Only in retrospect may the government realise that greater oversight at earlier stages might have led to both better and more widely accepted policy. As I've said, some of that may be fairly obvious, but the fresh conundrum between the benefits of virtual participation for Parliament's representative function and maybe its linkage function versus the challenges or threats created for Parliament's policy-making functions from people being absent deserves careful consideration, particularly because while the virtues may be very visible, the problems are less immediately obvious. This dilemma affects not just the UK, where the Commons only dabbled in virtual participation, but legislatures around the world. perhaps particularly those covering far larger geographic areas, where the temptation to enhance virtual participation long-term may be greatest. In the UK, in the middle of a continuing pandemic, arguments for virtual participation remain principled ones to restore parliamentarians equal rights. Jacob Rees-Mogg's position on this has seemed absurd and wrong. But longer term, this isn't just an argument about tradition versus modernity. It raises complex questions about how to balance the different functions of parliaments and their needs to operate effectively. We probably all feel the lack of informal contact around the fringes of online events like this one. But for parliaments, that lack is even greater and the consequences potentially far more serious.